The iron head of the axe bit into the frozen pine log with a dull, heavy thud that echoed off the canyon walls. Clara pulled the handle free, her breath clouding in the biting air, and swung again. This time the wood split with a sharp crack, the two halves tumbling onto the snow-dusted earth. She paused, leaning on the handle, and wiped a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. The sweat on her skin felt dangerously cold the moment she stopped moving. It was late December in the Montana Territory, the year 1874, and the sky was a bruised shade of purple, threatening snow. The wind had already begun to pick up, whistling through the gaps in the tree line like a mourning woman. Clara looked up at the gray expanse. She knew the smell of the air. A blizzard was coming, a heavy one, the kind that buried memories and mistakes alike under 5 feet of white silence. At 25 years old, Clara looked older. The frontier did that to women, especially women who lived alone at the end of a wagon rut that barely qualified as a road. Her hands were rough, calloused from the work that belonged to men. Her eyes, once a bright and hopeful blue, had dimmed into the color of a winter lake, guarded and deep. She gathered the split wood, stacking it into the crook of her arm until the weight strained her shoulders, then turned toward the cabin. It was a sturdy, weathered structure, built from logs that had grayed with age, crouching low against the earth as if trying to hide from the wind. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles. Inside, the cabin was dark, lit only by the embers in the hearth. Clara dropped the wood into the box with a clatter that seemed too loud in the stillness. Silence was her constant companion now. It sat at her table, slept in her bed, and followed her through the chores of the day. 2 years ago, the cabin was loud. It had been filled with the heavy, stumbling footsteps of Silas, the crash of breaking crockery, and the roar of his drunken rage. Silas, even thinking his name brought a phantom ache to the ribs he had broken 3 winters past. He had been a charming man when they married, full of big promises about cattle and gold. But the frontier had broken him long before it broke her. The whiskey took what was left. He had died 2 winters ago, frozen to death in a drift halfway between the saloon in town and their front porch, his heart giving out under the strain of liquor and cold. The townspeople did not see it that way. In the town of Purgatory Creek, 10 miles east, the whispers were different. They said Clara had locked him out. They said she had watched from the window while he pounded on the door, begging to be let in, until the pounding stopped. They called her the Ice Widow. They said she had ice in her veins where her blood ought to be. Clara never corrected them. Let them think she was cold. The cold was safe. Cold meant men kept their distance. She removed her heavy coat and hung it on the peg by the door. The cabin was drafty. She needed to check the chinking between the logs before the storm truly hit. She moved to the corner where she kept a bucket of clay and straw mixture, now dry and cracking, and added a splash of water to soften it. For the next hour, she worked methodically, pressing the daub into the cracks where the wind tried to invade. It was tedious work, but it kept her mind from wandering to the calendar on the wall. Christmas was 3 days away. She remembered Christmas before Montana. She remembered St. Louis, the smell of roasting goose and cinnamon, her mother's hands braiding red ribbons into her hair. There had been singing. There had been a piano in the parlor, and her father had played carols while the snow fell gently outside, picturesque and kind. Here, the snow was a weapon. There would be no ribbons this year. There would be no goose. She had a sack of dried beans, a side of salted venison she had traded for in October, and a jar of preserved peaches she was saving for Christmas morning. That was enough. It had to be enough. The wind outside howled, a sudden rising shriek that rattled the window pane in its frame. Clara flinched. The sound was too much like a human scream. She wiped her clay-stained hands on her apron and went to the window, peering out into the gathering dark. The storm had arrived. Snow was falling horizontally, driven by a gale that bent the tops of the pine trees. The world beyond the glass was disappearing, swallowed by a swirling white void. It was the kind of night where nothing living should be out, Even the wolves would be huddled deep in their dens. She turned back to the fire, adding a fresh log. The flames licked up, casting dancing shadows against the walls. The cabin felt smaller tonight, the walls pressing in. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness, so acute it almost brought her to her knees. It was not that she missed Silas, God, no, but she missed the presence of another human soul. She missed the sound of breathing that wasn't her own. She missed the feeling of safety, however illusionary it might be. She heated a pot of coffee on the iron hook over the fire, the smell of the bitter grounds filling the small room. She would drink a cup, read a chapter from her father's old Bible, and go to sleep. That was the routine. Survival was a series of routines repeated until death interrupted them. She was pouring the black liquid into a tin cup when she heard it. It was a sound distinct from the wind, distinct from the creaking of the timbers. It was a heavy, dull thud against the solid wood of the door. Clara froze, the pot suspended in her hand. Perhaps it was a branch, torn loose by the gale. Thud, thud. No branch knocked with a rhythm. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. No one came out this far, not in winter, and certainly not in a blizzard. The only people who rode in weather like this were desperate men or dangerous ones. She set the coffee pot down on the hearth, the metal clinking softly against the stone. She moved to the corner of the room where her husband's Winchester rifle leaned against the wall. She checked the lever, ensuring a round was chambered. The weight of the gun was familiar in her hands. She had learned to shoot out of necessity, hunting deer when the larder ran low, but she had never leveled the weapon at a human being. "Who is there?" she called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the noise of the storm. There was no answer, only the wind screaming around the eaves. She waited, the rifle stock pressed against her shoulder, her finger hovering over the trigger guard. Perhaps she had imagined it. The mind played tricks in isolation. The wind could sound like voices. The shifting snow could sound like footsteps. Then came a sound she could not mistake, the scrape of a body sliding down the rough-hewn timber of the door, followed by a low, guttural groan of pain. Clara lowered the rifle slightly. A man. Someone was out there, and they were falling. She moved to the door, her fear warring with a basic instinct to preserve life. If she opened it, she let the storm in. If she opened it, she let the world in. But if she left it closed, whoever was on the other side would be a frozen corpse by morning. She knew the bite of the frost. She would not wish that death on a dog, let alone a man. She unlatched the heavy oak bar and lifted it. The wind slammed the door open the moment the latch cleared, tearing the handle from her grip. A blast of ice and snow exploded into the room, instantly chilling the air. Clara squinted against the gale, shielding her eyes with one arm. A dark shape lay crumpled across the threshold. He was face down, his legs trailing out into the snowbank that was rapidly forming on the porch. He wore a heavy buffalo coat that was matted with ice, and a wide-brimmed hat lay half buried in the drift beside his head. "Get up!" Clara shouted over the wind. "You cannot lie there." The man did not move. She grabbed the door frame to steady herself against the gusts and leaned down, gripping the man's shoulder. He was heavy, solid muscle and dead weight. She pulled, her boots slipping on the floorboards. "Help me! Damn you!" she gritted out. He let out a sharp gasp as she yanked him, but his limbs remained useless. He was unconscious, or close to it. Clara realized with a sinking dread that she had to do this alone. She hooked her arms under his armpits, ignoring the damp cold of his coat soaking into her dress, and heaved backward. It was a struggle that strained every sinew in her back. Inch by inch, she dragged him across the threshold, his boots scraping loudly on the wood. The wind fought her, trying to push him back out, but Clara was farm strong. She gave one final, guttural cry of effort and pulled him clear of the door swing. She released him and threw her weight against the door, forcing it shut against the gale. She slammed the latch home and dropped the bar, gasping for breath. The silence returned, sudden and ringing, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the man on her floor. Clara stood over him, chest heaving. Now that the wind was shut out, the reality of the situation crashed down on her. There was a strange man in her house, a large man. She picked up the rifle again, backing away until she was near the fireplace. "Mister?" she said. The man groaned and rolled onto his side. His face was turned toward the firelight. He was bearded, the hair dark and thick, caked with ice that was beginning to melt and drip onto the floorboards. His skin was gray, the pallor of shock. But it was the blood that caught her eye. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the side of his buffalo coat. Just above the hip, it wasn't old blood, it was fresh, bright crimson against the worn leather. He hadn't just frozen, he had been shot. Clara's grip on the rifle tightened. Shotmen meant trouble. Shotmen meant lawmen, or outlaws, or feuds, none of which she wanted within 100 miles of her door. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice sharper now. The man's eyelids fluttered. He opened them halfway. His eyes were dark, unfocused, swimming with pain and fever. He looked at her, but he seemed to look through her, as if she were a ghost. "The horse," he rasped. His voice was like gravel grinding together. "Is the horse—" "There is no horse," Clara said. "Just you." He tried to push himself up, his hands scrabbling for purchase on the rug, but his arm gave way and he collapsed back with a hiss of breath. "My saddlebags." "You are bleeding," Clara said. "Be still." She watched him for a moment longer, assessing the threat. He was in no condition to attack her. If she didn't stop the bleeding, he wouldn't be a problem for anyone ever again. Clara set the rifle down, though she kept it within arm's reach. She went to the cabinet and retrieved a pair of heavy shears, a clean linen towel she had been saving for summer, and the bottle of whiskey Silas had hidden behind the flour sack, the one she hadn't poured out. She knelt beside him. The heat of the fire was melting the snow on his clothes, creating a puddle of muddy water mixed with the blood. The metallic scent of iron filled the small room, overpowering the coffee. "I'm going to cut your coat," she told him. "Do not fight me." He didn't answer. His eyes had slid closed again. Clara worked the shears through the thick hide of the buffalo coat. It was ruined anyway. She peeled the heavy layers back. Underneath, he wore a wool shirt that was soaked through. She cut that too, exposing the skin of his torso. She drew a sharp breath. The wound was an ugly thing. A bullet had torn a furrow along his side, just above the hip bone. It was deep, but it looked like it had passed through the flesh without shattering the bone. A flesh wound, but a severe one. The cold had likely slowed the bleeding, but now that he was warming up, the blood was flowing freely again. But it wasn't just the fresh wound that made her stare. The man's torso was a map of violence. Old scars, white and jagged, crisscrossed his ribs and chest. There was a burn mark on his shoulder that looked like a brand. A long, thin line ran from his collarbone to his sternum, the memory of a knife fight from years ago. This was a body that had been broken and put back together more times than she could count. And there, holstered tight under his left arm in a leather rig that looked well-oiled and used, was a heavy Colt revolver. Even in his delirium, his left arm seemed to guard it instinctively. Clara stared at the gun. It was not a hunter's weapon. It was a man-killer's tool. The handle was worn smooth by a hand that held it often. She should take it. She knew she should take it. A wise woman would disarm him while he was weak. She reached out, her hand hovering over the pistol butt. The man's hand shot out, lightning fast despite his condition, and clamped around her wrist. Clara cried out, jerking back, but his grip was iron. His eyes snapped open. They were clear now, terrifyingly lucid for a split second. There was no fever in that look, only the cold, predatory assessment of a wolf cornered in a trap. "Don't," he whispered. The word was barely audible, but the command was absolute. Clara's heart hammered in her throat. She looked into his eyes, dark, rimmed with exhaustion, but burning with a terrifying intensity. "I am trying to help you," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steal it. "You are bleeding on my floor." He held her gaze for a long second, searching for something, deceit, perhaps, or weakness. Then, slowly, the tension left his arm. His grip on her wrist loosened. His eyes lost their focus again, the fever reclaiming him. "Don't take the gun," he mumbled, his head lolling back onto the floor. "They're coming." "Who is coming?" Clara demanded. But he was gone, slipping back into the dark waters of unconsciousness. Clara rubbed her wrist where his fingers had left white marks. She stared at the gun, then at his face. He had a strong face, lean and weathered, with a few days' growth of beard that held droplets of melted snow. He didn't look like the town drunks. He didn't look like the soft shopkeepers. He looked like the land outside, hard, unforgiving, and capable of sudden violence. She decided not to touch the gun. Not yet. She went to work. She poured the whiskey over the wound. The man flinched in his sleep, a low growl vibrating in his chest. But he didn't wake. She packed the linen towel against the torn flesh and pressed down hard, using her weight to staunch the flow. For an hour she sat there, applying pressure, listening to the storm rage outside. The wind battered the cabin walls, shaking the timbers. But the man didn't move. When the bleeding finally slowed to a seepage, she bandaged him tightly, wrapping the strips of linen around his waist. It was difficult work, lifting his dead weight to pass the cloth underneath. But she managed. She couldn't leave him on the floor. The drafts were strongest there. She looked at her bed, a narrow frame in the corner with a quilt she had stitched herself. It was the only bed. "Damn you," she whispered to the unconscious stranger. She grabbed him under the arms again and dragged him to the bed. He was heavier than a sack of feed. She had to lift his legs up last. He barely fit. His boots hung off the end. She unlaced them and pulled them off, revealing thick wool socks with holes in the heels. She covered him with the quilt, then added her own heavy woolen blanket on top. She stood back, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. He looked almost peaceful now, the harsh lines of his face smoothed by sleep. But she couldn't forget the speed of his hand, or the scars on his ribs. Eli. The name came to her mind, though she didn't know why. He looked like an Eli, or a Caleb, someone from the Old Testament, bearing a heavy burden. She went to the basin and washed the blood from her hands. The water turned pink. She scrubbed until her skin was raw. She did not sleep in the bed that night. Clara pulled the rocking chair close to the fire. She wrapped herself in her coat and sat down, the Winchester rifle across her lap. Outside, the blizzard buried the world in white. Inside, the fire popped and hissed. Clara watched the chest of the stranger rise and fall. Every shadow that flickered across his face made her grip the rifle tighter. He said they were coming. She looked at the door, barred and bolted. It felt flimsy now. The solitude she had cursed only hours ago now seemed like a lost luxury. She had wanted someone to break the silence. Now the silence was broken by the ragged breathing of a gunman, and the fear in her belly was colder than the winter wind. Clara sat vigil as the night deepened, her eyes wide, waiting for the morning, or for the man to wake, wondering which would bring more danger. The clock on the mantel ticked. 1 hour past midnight. Christmas Eve was coming, and for the first time in 2 years, she was not alone. The thought terrified her more than the storm. The morning light was not so much light as it was a dull, slate-gray lifting of the dark. It seeped through the frosted window panes of the cabin, casting long, spectral shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. Clara woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright in the rocking chair, her fingers white-knuckled around the stock of the Winchester rifle she had not let go of all night. The fire had burned down to a bed of sullen red coals, and the cabin was biting cold. She blinked, shaking the sleep from her eyes, and looked immediately toward the bed. It was empty. Panic, sharp and sudden, seized her chest. She stood up too quickly, the chair rocking violently behind her, and swung the rifle barrel toward the rest of the room. "Easy," a voice said. It was low, rough like gravel scraping against iron, but steady. Eli was sitting on the wood box near the hearth. He had wrapped the quilt around his shoulders like a cape, his face pale and drawn, beads of sweat standing out on his forehead despite the chill. In his lap, He held his Colt revolver. He wasn't pointing it at her, but he was cleaning it with a scrap of rag, his movements slow and deliberate. Clara lowered the rifle but did not uncock it. She stared at him. He looked like death warmed over, his eyes sunken and rimmed with red. But he was awake, and he was watching her with a gaze that was entirely devoid of trust. "You are up," Clara said, her voice raspy from the dry air. "Hard to sleep when a woman is pointing a Winchester at my head all night," Eli replied. He snapped the cylinder of the revolver back into place with a sharp click that echoed in the small room. He holstered the weapon, wincing as the movement pulled at the wound in his side. "I did not know if you were going to die or kill me," Clara said defensively. "A woman alone cannot be too careful." Eli looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes traveled from the rifle in her hands to the dark circles under her eyes, then to the heavy bar across the door. He gave a short, humorless nod. "I suppose not," he muttered. He tried to stand, gripping the edge of the hearth mantel for support. His legs shook and his face went gray, but he forced himself upright. "You should lie down." Clara stepped forward instinctively, then stopped herself. "You lost a lot of blood." "I have lost blood before." Eli grunted. He looked at the stove. "You have coffee?" "I do." "I would be obliged." It was a strange, tentative truce. Clara set the rifle down against the wall, close enough to grab, but far enough to show a sliver of trust, and went to the stove. She stoked the fire, adding fresh kindling until the flames roared back to life. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her back. It made the skin between her shoulder blades prickle. It had been 2 years since a man had been inside this cabin, and the energy in the room had shifted. It felt smaller, heavier. Over the next hour, Eli proved to be a man of few words and stubborn resolve. He drank the black coffee in silence, his hand trembling slightly as he held the tin cup, when the wind outside slammed a shutter against the log wall, rattling the door on its hinges. He frowned. He stood up, ignoring Clara's protest, and limped to the door. He examined the top hinge, which had been loose for months, groaning with every gust. Without asking, he took a heavy knife from his belt, a tool Clara had not noticed the night before, and used the flat of the blade to drive the loose pin back into the wood. He tested it, satisfied when the rattling stopped. "Draft was coming through there," he said, sheathing the knife. "Was letting the heat out." Clara watched him, stunned. Silas would have kicked the door for making noise. He would have cursed the wind. He never would have fixed it. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Eli just nodded and went back to the fire, sinking onto the wood box as if the effort had cost him his last reserve of strength. "You can stay," Clara said, her voice firming up as she tried to establish the boundaries of this arrangement. "You can stay until the storm breaks. The pass will snow for at least 3 days, but when the road is clear, you go. I will not have trouble here." Eli looked up at her from under his brow. The firelight caught the sharp angle of his jaw. "I am not looking to bring you trouble, ma'am, just looking to survive the week." "Good," Clara said. She turned back to the wash basin, scrubbing a pot. "My name is Clara." There was a pause. "Eli," he said. The blizzard did not break. If anything, it grew more ferocious. The world outside ceased to exist, replaced by a wall of howling white that buried the windows and piled snow high against the door. They were trapped. The days blurred into a rhythm of survival. Morning meant breaking the ice on the water bucket and stoking the fire. Afternoon meant watching the light fade too early. Evening meant silence, heavy and thick. They ate meager meals, cornbread made from the last of the meal, beans seasoned with salt pork, and coffee that grew weaker with every pot. Clara moved around him like a wary cat, conscious of every inch of space. The cabin had only one room, and there was nowhere to hide. Yet, she found herself watching him when she thought he was asleep. She watched the way his large hands, scarred and calloused, held the delicate china cup she had brought from St. Louis. She watched the way he stared into the fire, his expression haunted by ghosts she could not see. He was a violent man. She had seen the gun, the scars, but he moved with a quiet carefulness, as if he were afraid he might break the room itself. On the third night, the wind died down to a low moan, leaving a silence that felt loud in the small space. They sat by the fire, finishing a supper of venison broth. "You live out here alone," Eli said. It was not a question. He was whittling a piece of firewood, carving thin, curling strips that fell into the hearth. "I do," Clara answered, mending a tear in her wool shawl. "Husband?" "Dead." Clara bit off a piece of thread. 2 winters ago." Eli paused in his whittling. "Sorry." "Don't be," Clara said sharply. The words came out before she could check them. She looked up and saw Eli watching her. His knife stilled. Maybe it was the isolation, or the way the firelight softened the harsh lines of the room. But the dam inside her, built of 2 years of silence, developed a crack. "He was a bad man," Clara said, her voice low. "He drank. He had a temper that was bigger than this valley." Eli didn't look away. He didn't offer platitudes. He just listened. "He used to say I thought I was better than him because I could read." Clara continued, her eyes fixing on the flames. "One night, he came home drunker than usual. He took my books. My father gave me those books. Shakespeare, Dickens. A Bible with my name in gold leaf." Her voice trembled, not with sadness, but with a cold, hard anger. "He threw them in this fire. He made me watch them burn. He said if he could not understand the words, I had no business reading them." She looked at the fireplace, seeing the ghosts of the pages curling into ash. "He hit me when I tried to pull them out. He said I was looking at the books the way a woman looks at a lover. He accused me of things, with men in town I had never even spoken to." She stopped, breathing hard. She had never told anyone that. The town thought Silas was a tragic figure, a man taken by the cold. They didn't know about the bruises she had painted over with flour and water. Eli sat perfectly still. His jaw was set so tight a muscle feathered in his cheek. He did not tell her it was okay. He did not try to hush her. He simply nodded, a slow, dark acknowledgement of the cruelty of men. "Some men," Eli said softly, "need to make things small so they can feel big." Clara looked at him, surprised by the insight. "And you, Eli, what do you need?" Eli resumed whittling, the knife slicing through the wood with aggressive force. "I just need to keep moving." "Who shot you?" Clara asked. She had wanted to ask for 3 days. Eli stopped. He looked at the gun belt hanging off the back of the chair. "Men I used to ride with," he said. "A long time ago. I fell in a bad spot. We drove cattle mostly, but then the cattle drives turned into other things. Bank jobs, trains." Clara's hand stilled on her sewing. She was sitting across from an outlaw. She should be terrified. But looking at him, at the weary slope of his shoulders and the blood seeping through the bandage at his side, she felt only a strange kinship. "Why did they shoot you?" "Because I grew a conscience," Eli said, his voice bitter. "We were down in Wyoming. The boss wanted to hang a marshal we had caught. A good man. Had a wife and kids back in Cheyenne. I told them no. They didn't like hearing no." He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "I let the marshal go. My partners called me a traitor. They have been tracking me north for weeks. They aim to finish what they started." The silence that followed was heavy. Clara realized then that the storm outside was the only thing keeping death away. When the snow cleared, the past would come riding up the valley. "You are safe here," Clara said, though she knew it was a fragile promise. "No one is safe around me, Clara," Eli replied. "But I thank you for the fire." The tension in the cabin shifted after that night. The wariness remained, but it was different. It was no longer the fear of stranger against stranger. It was the electric, humming tension of 2 people who had seen each other's scars. 2 nights later, Clara returned from the lean-to shed attached to the back of the cabin, shaking snow from her skirts. She carried a bucket of frozen milk she had chipped from the churn. She pushed the door open and stepped into the main room. She stopped dead. Eli was standing by the fire, He had stripped off his shirt to clean his wound. The firelight washed over his bare torso, painting him in gold and shadow. He was lean, his body made of corded muscle and bone, but it was the map of his life that took her breath away. The scars she had seen briefly when he was unconscious were more vivid now. The puckered star of the bullet wound on his side was angry and red, but healing. Across his back, which was turned slightly toward her, were long, pale ridges, lash marks. Someone had whipped him, years ago. He heard the door close and turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to his waist, though he wasn't wearing his gun belt. For a moment, neither of them moved. Clara stared at his chest, at the dark hair that trailed down his stomach, at the raw masculinity of him exposed in her kitchen. A heat, sudden and fierce, flushed through her body, starting at her neck and flooding her face. It wasn't fear, it was a jolt of physical awareness so strong it made her knees weak. Eli saw her staring. He didn't cover himself. He stood there, half naked and vulnerable, watching her eyes travel over him. His breathing hitched, his chest rising and falling in a jagged rhythm. I was changing the dressing," he said, his voice thick. "I see," Clara whispered. She couldn't look away. She wanted to reach out and trace the line of the scar on his shoulder. She wanted to know the texture of his skin. The thought was scandalous, shocking, and entirely undeniable. She forced herself to turn away, setting the bucket down with a clatter that was too loud. "I will put the kettle on." "Clara," he said. She froze. "I'm decent now." He lied. He wasn't. He was still shirtless, but he had picked up the rag to wipe the water from his chest. She didn't turn back. She couldn't. "Wrap it tight, Eli, or it will bleed again." Later that night, the air in the cabin felt charged, as if a summer storm were building inside the four walls. Every sound was magnified. The pop of the wood, the scrape of a chair, the sound of swallowing. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee. She walked over to where Eli sat, fully clothed now, but still radiating that dangerous heat. She held the cup out to him. He reached for it. Their fingers brushed. It was a small contact, the graze of rough skin against smooth, but it felt like a spark from the fire had landed on them. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She didn't pull her hand away. Neither did he. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood there, connected by the tin cup and the brush of fingertips. Clara looked down at his hand, large, capable of violence, yet trembling slightly now. She looked up into his face. Eli's eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. He was looking at her mouth. The longing in his expression was naked, raw, and terrifying. He took a step closer, invading her space, his scent of wood smoke and soap filling her senses. Clara's lips parted. She waited. She wanted him to cross the line. She wanted him to shatter the ice. But Eli stopped. A muscle worked in his jaw. He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if fighting a war within himself. And then he stepped back. He took the cup from her hand, his touch disappearing as quickly as it had come. "Thank you," he muttered, turning away to stare into the fire. Clara stood there, her hand still suspended in the air, cold where his warmth had been. A sharp pang of rejection pierced her, followed immediately by relief. It was dangerous. It was wrong. She was a widow. He was a drifter. She went to bed early, blowing out the lantern and leaving the room in the dim glow of the embers. Eli made his bed on the floor by the hearth, using the buffalo coat as a mattress. Clara lay under the heavy quilts, her body rigid. The cabin was silent, save for the wind and the rhythmic breathing of the man 10 feet away. She could not sleep. Her skin felt tight, sensitive. The memory of his bare chest, the ridges of his scars, the heat of his gaze. It played over and over in her mind like a fever dream. She turned onto her side, facing the wall. Her hand slid down her stomach, slipping beneath the fabric of her nightgown. She shouldn't. It was a sin. It was weak. But hunger was a living thing. It gnawed at her, an ache that was both physical and emotional. She touched herself, tentatively at first, then with a desperate, stifled rhythm. She bit her lip to keep from making a sound, tears pricking her eyes. She imagined it was his hand. She imagined his rough fingers tracing her skin, his weight pressing her into the mattress, driving away the cold and the loneliness. She shuddered, her back arching under the heavy wool, a silent gasp escaping her throat as the release washed over her. It was brief, and it was followed immediately by a crushing wave of shame. She lay panting in the dark, acutely aware that Eli was just across the room. Had he heard her shifting? Had he heard the catch in her breath? She pulled her knees to her chest and squeezed her eyes shut, hating the need that made her body betray her. Morning came with a brilliant, blinding sun. The storm had broken in the night. The world outside was a glittering expanse of diamond-white snow, peaceful and still. Clara woke feeling raw and exposed. She dressed quickly, avoiding looking at the spot on the floor where Eli slept. When she came out from behind the curtain she used for privacy, Eli was already up. He was standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley. He looked tense. He turned when he heard her. His face was unreadable. "Storms broke," he said. "Yes," Clara said, moving to the stove. "I suppose the road will be clear by tomorrow." "Likely." He watched her fill the kettle. He didn't move to help her this time. "You were crying in your sleep last night," he said suddenly. Clara froze, the ladle hovering over the water bucket. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Had he heard? Did he know? She turned to face him, her chin lifting in a defensive posture. "I heard you," Eli said, his voice soft. "You made a sound, like you were in pain." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a hot flood of embarrassment. "It was a nightmare," she lied, her voice brittle. "I have them sometimes. About Silas." Eli watched her for a long moment. He took a step toward her, and the distance between them felt charged again, but different this time. It wasn't just attraction. It was an acknowledgement of shared brokenness. "I have nightmares too," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wake up reaching for a gun that isn't there." He looked at her hands, which were gripping the ladle so tight her knuckles were white. "You don't have to hide from me." "Clara," he said, "we are both just trying to get through the night." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the wall between them, the wall she had built with bricks of shame and fear, begin to show a hairline fracture. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't Silas. "Breakfast will be ready soon," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll fetch more wood," Eli said. He walked past her to the door. As he passed, the air shifted, carrying his scent. He didn't touch her, but the space he left behind vibrated with his presence. Clara watched him walk out into the snow. The dread of him leaving was now warring with a new, more dangerous fear, the fear of what would happen if he stayed. The snow did not stop. It fell with a relentless, suffocating weight, burying the Montana territory under 5 feet of silence. The cabin, once a lonely outpost on the edge of the world, had become a capsule, entirely cut off from the passage of time. There was no town, no judgment, no past, and no future. There were only the 4 walls of hewn log, the stone hearth, and the 2 people breathing within them. For 3 days, the white drifts piled against the windows, turning the light inside to a perpetual, milky twilight. They were truly trapped, in any other winter, with any other man. Clara might have felt the creeping panic of claustrophobia, but with Eli, the confinement felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The violence of his arrival had faded into a quiet, domestic rhythm that was terrifying in its intimacy. They moved around each other in the small space like 2 planets that had finally found a stable orbit. Eli was healing with the unnatural resilience of a man who had spent his life refusing to die. Though his side was still stiff and bound in linen, the fever had broken completely. He could not sit idle. Idleness seemed to itch at him more than the wound. On the 4th afternoon, he found a stack of scrap lumber in the lean-to, seasoned oak slats that Silas had meant to use for a porch he never built. Eli dragged them inside, shaking off the snow, and set to work. "You have nowhere to stack the dry wood near the fire," he noted, his voice rough but absent from its earlier edge. You are tracking snow across the floor every time you fetch a log. I manage, Clara said. She was at the table, her hands dusted with flour, kneading dough for cornbread. You shouldn't have to just manage, Eli replied. He sat on the wood box, his knife working the oak. He didn't have proper carpentry tools, just his heavy Bowie knife and a hammer he had found. But his hands were skilled. Clara watched him covertly as she worked. He shaved the joints with precision, testing the fit of the wood with a patience that contradicted the violence she knew lived in him. There was something deeply unsettling about seeing a man who killed for a living building something for her home. It was a domestic act, a husband's act. The smell of baking cornmeal and pine shavings filled the cabin, replacing the scent of stale fear that had hung there for 2 years. It was a warm, yellow smell. Clara slid the iron skillet into the oven, wiping her hands on her apron. It is finished, Eli said an hour later. He stood back. He had constructed a sturdy, neat rack that fit perfectly into the alcove by the hearth. He stacked the split logs into it, arranging them by size. It is fine work, Eli, Clara said softly. Eli looked at the rack, then at her. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking almost embarrassed. It will keep the floor dry. Thank you. They stood close to one another. The heat from the stove radiated between them. For a moment, the silence was heavy with unspoken things, gratitude, wonder, and a growing magnetic pull that frightened them both. That evening, the wind died down, leaving a silence so profound it rang in the ears. The fire crackled, casting long, leaping shadows against the ceiling. Clara went to the cupboard and retrieved the bottle of whiskey. It was the same bottle she'd used to clean his wound, but there was plenty left. She pulled the cork with a soft thwack. For the cold, she said, pouring a measure into 2 tin cups. Eli looked at the cup, then at her. He took it. For the cold. They drank. The liquor burned a path down Clara's throat, settling in her stomach as a warm, golden weight. It loosened the knot of anxiety that had lived in her chest since Silas died. She took another sip, then another, her cheeks flushed. My father used to play the fiddle on Christmas Eve, Clara said, staring into the flames. The memory felt sharp, piercing. We would dance in the parlor. I wore a blue ribbon. I never had much time for dancing, Eli said. He was sitting in the rocking chair, his long legs stretched out toward the hearth. Mostly just riding? Everyone has time for dancing, Clara murmured. If they make it. The whiskey made her bold. Or perhaps it wasn't the whiskey. Perhaps it was the realization that they might die here when the men came, and she had spent 2 years living like a ghost in her own life. She was tired of being a ghost. She wanted to be flesh and blood. She stood up. The floorboards were warm near the hearth. Slowly, deliberately. She reached down and unlaced her boots. She kicked them aside. Then she peeled off her wool stockings. Eli watched her. His cup arrested halfway to his mouth. His eyes dropped to her bare feet, pale and vulnerable against the dark wood floor. Clara reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. The heavy dark mass tumbled down her back, cascading over her shoulders like a curtain. She shook her head, letting it fall loose, wild and unkempt. She began to hum. It was a low, mournful tune, something half-remembered from her childhood. She swayed, her bare feet moving silently on the planks. She closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the fire on her skin, feeling the brush of her skirt against her ankles. She turned, a slow, solitary pirouette in the firelight. She was dancing for herself. She was dancing to prove she was still alive, but she was also dancing for him. She could feel his gaze on her. It was a physical weight, heavier than the quilt, hotter than the fire. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Eli had not moved. His hand was gripping the tin cup so hard his knuckles were white ridges. His face was in shadow, but the firelight caught his eyes. They were dark, dilated, burning with a look that was terrified and starving. He looked like a man watching an angel fall from grace, or perhaps a man watching his salvation and knowing he couldn't touch it. Clara stopped moving. The humming died in her throat. The air in the room thickened, turning electric. The scent of wood smoke and desire was overpowering. She should stop. She should pin her hair back up and go to her side of the room. That was what a good woman would do. That was what a safe woman would do. Clara took a step toward him. Eli flinched, as if he expected a blow. She took another step, then another. She crossed the distance between them until she was standing between his spread knees. He looked up at her, his expression tortured. He did not breathe. Clara reached out. Her hand trembled, but she did not pull back. She placed her palm flat against his chest, over the wool of his shirt. She could feel his heart hammering beneath the ribs, a frantic, thudding rhythm that matched her own. Slowly, she slid her hand down his chest, over the rough fabric, until she reached his hand where it rested on his thigh. She took his hand in hers. It was large, calloused, a weapon of a hand. She guided it to her waist. She pressed his palm against the curve of her hip. Eli let out a sound that was half groan, half gasp. His fingers flexed involuntarily, gripping the fabric of her dress, gripping the flesh beneath it. He didn't pull away. He held on to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of snow. "Clara," he rasped. It was a warning. It was a plea. "Don't speak," she whispered. She leaned down. Their lips met. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the chaste, polite pressing of lips she had read about in novels. It was a collision. It was awkward and clumsy and desperate. Eli dropped the cup. It clattered to the floor, spilling the dregs of the whiskey, but neither of them heard it. His other hand came up, tangling in her hair, gripping the back of her head to hold her to him. His mouth was hot, tasting of tobacco and whiskey. He kissed her with a hunger that frightened her, a starvation that had spanned years. Clara made a small noise in her throat and pressed closer, her hands clutching his shoulders. For a moment, they were just two animals seeking warmth, seeking proof of life. Then Eli tore himself away. He pushed her back, gentle but firm. He stood up, stumbling slightly, putting distance between them. He backed against the mantel, his chest heaving. "No," he said, his voice hoarse, cracked down the middle. "No, you don't know what you are doing." "I know exactly what I am doing," Clara said. Her lips felt swollen. Her blood was singing in her veins. "Look at me, Clara," Eli said, gesturing to himself, to his scars, to the gun belt hanging on the chair. "I am a killer. I am a man with a price on his head. You are a decent woman. You don't want this with a man like me. I will ruin you." "I am already ruined," Clara said, stepping toward him again. "The town thinks I killed my husband. They think I am ice. They think I am dead inside." She stopped in front of him. She looked up into his eyes, seeing the fear there, not fear of her, but fear for her. "I am tired of being cold, Eli," she said, her voice breaking. "I am tired of the silence. I want to feel something. I want to feel something with you." Eli stared at her. The resistance in his face began to crumble, cracked apart by the sheer force of her need. He looked at her hair, wild around her shoulders. He looked at her mouth, red from his kiss. "I will hurt you," he whispered. "I don't know how to be gentle." "Then don't be gentle," Clara answered. "Just be here." She reached out and took his hand again. This time, she led him away from the fire, toward the pile of buffalo furs and quilts she had arranged near the hearth for warmth. He followed her. He would have followed her into the fire itself. They sank down onto the furs. The heat of the hearth washed over them. Outside, the wind howled, scratching at the logs. But inside, the world had narrowed to the space of a blanket. Eli reached out and touched her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone, reverent, as if he were touching holy scripture. "You are beautiful," he said, the words sounding like a confession of guilt. "God help me, Clara, you are beautiful." He began to undo the buttons of her bodice. His large, scarred hands shook, fumbling with the small fastenings. Clara helped him, her fingers brushing his. When the dress fell open, he pushed it from her shoulders. She shivered, not from cold, but from the exposure. She was wearing a simple cotton chemise underneath. She felt naked, stripped of the armor she had worn for 2 years. Eli pulled his shirt over his head, wincing as his wound stretched. He tossed it aside. He was bare to the waist now, the firelight dancing over the map of violence on his skin. Clara ran her hands over his chest, tracing the ridge of the white scar on his collarbone. He hissed in a breath at her touch. He laid her back against the furs. The buffalo hide was coarse against her skin, grounding her. He hovered over her, supporting his weight on his elbows to avoid crushing her. He looked down at her, his face open, defenseless. He reached for the hem of her nightgown. He pushed it up, slowly, past her knees, past her thighs. The air was cool against her skin, but his gaze was scorching. He stopped. He looked at her, his eyes dark pools of intensity. "Spread your legs," he whispered, his voice straining against the emotion in his throat. "And let me see you." The command was raw, guttural. It wasn't a demand for access. It was a plea for revelation. He wanted to see her, all of her, the parts of her that had been hidden and shamed and locked away. Clara trembled. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, sliding into her hair. She did as he asked. She opened herself to him. Eli let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at her with a worshipful gaze, as if he were seeing the sunrise after a lifetime of darkness. He reached out and touched her, his fingers rough but impossibly tender. Clara gasped, her hips arching off the furs. "Eli," she sobbed. He moved over her then. He settled between her legs, his body heavy and solid and real. When he entered her, he watched her face. He didn't close his eyes. He watched every flicker of emotion, every catch of breath. It was slow. It was a reclaiming. It was the breaking of a fast that had lasted a lifetime. Clara wrapped her legs around him, pulling him closer, wanting to merge her broken pieces with his. The friction was exquisite. A sharp, bright pain that dissolved into pleasure. She cried out, burying her face in the crook of his neck, tasting the salt of his skin. Eli moved with a rhythm that was desperate but restrained. He was holding back, trying to give her everything, trying to make sure she felt worshipped. "Clara," he groaned. "Clara." The release, when it came, shattered her. It wasn't just a physical spasm. It was an emotional dam bursting. 2 years of grief, of loneliness, of holding herself together with iron will. It all came pouring out. She convulsed in his arms, sobbing, her fingernails digging into his shoulders. Eli held her through it. He drove into her one last time, a guttural cry tearing from his throat as he found his own release, spilling his life into hers. He collapsed against her, his weight pressing her into the furs. He was shaking, for a long time. The only sound in the cabin was their ragged breathing and the pop of the fire. Clara lay there, tears drying on her cheeks. She felt raw, scoured clean. The emptiness inside her was gone, filled with the warmth of him. Eli rolled to the side, taking the weight off her, but he didn't leave. He pulled the heavy quilt over them, cocooning them in a private world of wool and heat. He pulled her against him, his back to her chest, his arm draped heavy over her waist. He buried his face in her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the dark. "Don't be," Clara answered, her voice thick with sleep and peace. She pressed a kiss to the scar on his shoulder. He held her tighter. There were no more words. There was only the warmth of 2 bodies in the howling dark, holding onto each other as the snow buried the world. For the first time in years, the ghosts were silent. The days that followed the breaking of the storm possessed a fragility that was terrified to breathe. The blizzard had sealed the cabin in a cocoon of white silence, creating a world where only 2 people existed. But as the sun melted the drifts and the icicles began to weep from the eaves, the reality of the outside world pressed against the logs. Inside, however, there was a tentative, aching sweetness. Clara and Eli moved around one another with a new awareness. The desperate, starving energy of that first night had settled into something softer, though no less intense. They were like 2 survivors of a shipwreck who had washed up on the same island, unable to believe their luck. yet constantly scanning the horizon for the storm that would finish them. Eli did not sit idle. His side was healing, the angry red of the wound fading to a dull pink, though it still pulled tight when he twisted. He spent the long, sunlit mornings by the fire, working with his knife. He had found a piece of seasoned birch in the woodpile, hard and pale, and he whittled it with the same obsessive focus he applied to cleaning his gun. Clara watched him from the table where she mended his coat. The buffalo hide was tough, requiring a heavy needle and a thimble to pierce. She had run out of black thread months ago, and the only spool left in her sewing basket was a vibrant, blood-red silk her mother had sent her from St. Louis for embroidery. She hesitated before threading the needle. It was a bright, screaming color against the dark. Weathered leather, it would stand out. It would mark him. She threaded it anyway. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. Eli blew the shavings from the wood. He held it up to the light, squinting. "You have been using your fingers to comb your hair," he said without looking at her. "A woman ought to have a comb." Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks. It was such a small thing, a trivial vanity in the face of survival. Yet he had noticed. He had noticed her struggles with the tangles in the morning. "I broke my last one a year ago," she admitted. Eli grunted, returning the blade to the wood. "This birch is good, strong grain. It will not break." He worked on it for 2 days. When he finished, he sanded it smooth with a piece of pumice stone from the riverbed. He presented it to her on the 3rd evening, holding it out with a hesitation that betrayed his uncertainty. Clara took it. It was beautiful in its simplicity. The teeth were evenly spaced. The handle curved to fit her palm, and on the spine of the comb, he had carved a tiny, intricate vine. "Eli," she whispered. She ran her thumb over the carving. "It is lovely." "It is just wood," he muttered, looking away. But she saw the tips of his ears turn red. She went to him, the comb clutched in her hand, and kissed his cheek. He turned his head, capturing her mouth with a sudden, fierce hunger, pulling her onto his lap. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire popping beside them, holding onto the moment as if they could freeze time by sheer force of will. But they could not stop the world from turning. The larder was running dangerously low. The flour sack was nothing but dust, and the coffee tin was empty. "I have to go to town," Clara said the next morning, staring into the empty bin. Eli stiffened. He was oiling his holster, a ritual he performed every morning. "I will go." "You cannot," Clara said firmly. "You are a stranger." "Eli, a stranger with a gunshot wound and a face that looks like it has seen war. Purgatory Creek is a small town. They notice strangers. If you go, questions will be asked. If I go, it is just the widow Miller fetching beans." Eli didn't like it. She could see the objection rolling behind his dark eyes, the instinct to protect warring with the logic of survival. He stood up and paced the small room, his limp barely noticeable now. "They know me," Clara pressed. "They do not like me, but they know me. I will be quick. I will be back before dusk." Eli stopped pacing. He walked to her and placed his hands on her shoulders. His grip was heavy, grounding. "Take the rifle," he said, "and keep your head down." The ride to Purgatory Creek was a cold one. Clara hitched the mare to the sleigh, the runners hissing over the packed snow. The landscape was blindingly white, the sun reflecting off the drifts with a brilliance that made her eyes water. But the beauty of the valley felt threatening now. Every stand of trees looked like an ambush. Every shadow looked like a man on horseback. She reached the town just past noon. Purgatory Creek was a collection of 20 or so buildings huddled against the wind, their unpainted wood gray and sullen against the snow. Smoke rose from the chimneys, but there was no joy in it. Clara tied the mare in front of the general store. She could feel the eyes on her immediately. A curtain twitched in the boarding house window. 2 men shoveling snow in front of the saloon stopped their work, leaning on their shovels to watch her. She kept her chin high, the way her mother had taught her, and pushed open the door of the mercantile. The bell above the door jingled. a cheerful sound that seemed out of place. The shop was warm, smelling of sawdust, tobacco, and dried apples. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was behind the counter, weighing a sack of nails for old man Miller. Both men stopped talking when she entered. "Mrs. Miller," Henderson said. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth he offered other customers. "We did not expect to see you until spring. Thought the storm might have buried you." "The cabin stands. Mr. Henderson," Clara said, moving to the counter. She placed her list on the wood. "I need flour, coffee, lard, and cartridges. 45 caliber. The request for ammunition hung in the air. Henderson exchanged a look with old man Miller. 45? Miller wheezed, wiping his nose with a dirty rag. "That is a heavy load for a woman hunting rabbits. Clara, Silas used a rifle." "I need protection," Clara said coolly. "Wolves have been close." "Wolves," Miller sneered. He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her face, which had lost the gaunt, hollow look of winter starvation. There was color in her cheeks, a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You look flushed. Widow, keeping warm out there." Clara ignored him. "The supplies, please, Mr. Henderson." Henderson moved to fill the order, his movement slow and grudging. The silence in the shop was suffocating. Clara could feel Miller's gaze crawling over her. "Strange tracks on the north road," Miller said to the room at large. "Saw them yesterday. Shod horses, riders." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She kept her face impassive. "Saw a horse tied up at your place through the spyglass a week back," Miller continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Before the snow, a big bay. You don't own a bay, Clara?" Clara turned to face him. Her hands were trembling, but she hid them in the folds of her coat. "A traveler," she said. "He asked for directions to the pass. He did not stay." Miller stepped closer. He smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed wool. "Is that so? Because you look like a woman who has been well fed recently. You look like a woman who has been comforted." He grinned, revealing yellow, broken teeth. "Whoring for another husband already, or just giving it away to any drifter who warms your bed." The insult hit her like a physical blow. The heat rushed to her face, burning and sharp. In the past, she would have looked at the floor. She would have swallowed the shame and hurried away. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She had danced by the fire. She had held Eli in the dark. She knew what it was to be cherished, and it made the cruelty of these small, bitter men seem pathetic. "My life is my own, Mr. Miller," Clara said, her voice shaking but loud enough to ring in the rafters. "And my bed is none of your concern. Perhaps if you spent more time minding your own home, your wife would not look so miserable in hers." The silence that followed was absolute. Henderson stopped scooping flour. Miller's jaw dropped, his face turning a mottled purple. "You watch your tongue," Miller hissed, stepping forward with a raised hand. Clara's hand dropped to the pocket of her coat, where she had slipped the small skinning knife before leaving the cabin. She didn't draw it, but her stance shifted, weight on her back foot. "Ready." Miller saw the shift. He saw the cold, hard light in her blue eyes, the same look Eli had when he watched the door. He faltered. "Here are your goods," Henderson said loudly, slamming a sack onto the counter. "Take them and go." Clara threw the coins onto the counter, more than was needed, but she wouldn't wait for change. She grabbed the heavy sack with one hand, hefted the box of cartridges with the other, and backed out of the door. She didn't run to the sleigh, but she walked fast. She threw the supplies into the back and untied the mare with fumbling fingers. As she climbed onto the seat, she saw Miller standing in the doorway of the shop, watching her with a look of pure malice. She snapped the reins, and the mare bolted forward. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the cabin, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. She was shivering, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash. Eli opened the door before she even stepped onto the porch. He had been watching. He saw her face, pale, drawn, eyes wide with residual panic, and he pulled her inside, kicking the door shut behind her. "What happened?" he demanded. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He checked her with his hands, gripping her arms, scanning her for blood. "I am fine," Clara said, but her voice was brittle. She tried to step away, to put the supplies down, but her legs gave out. Eli caught her. He lowered her into the rocking chair and knelt before her. "Clara, tell me," she told him. She told him about Miller, about the tracks they had seen, about the vile words he had spat at her. She told him about the accusation of whoring. As she spoke, Eli went very still. The concern in his face hardened into something terrifying. His eyes became flat and black, devoid of light. It was the face of the man who had killed for a living. The rage radiating off him was a physical heat, sharper and more dangerous than the fire. "He touched you?" Eli asked. His voice was a low rumble, barely a whisper. "No," Clara said. "He wanted to, but he didn't." Eli stood up. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkening valley toward the town. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "I should ride down there," he said. "I should cut his tongue out." "No!" Clara cried. She launched herself from the chair and grabbed his arm. "No, Eli, that is what they want. They want a fight. If you go down there, you prove them right. You prove you are the monster they think is hiding out here." Eli looked down at her. The violence in him was warring with the tenderness he felt for her. He was shaking with the effort of holding it back. "They insulted you," he said, "because of me. I do not care what they say." Clara lied. She gripped his shirt, pulling him away from the window. "I do not care about them. I care about you. I care about us staying alive." Eli let out a long breath through his nose. He covered her hand with his. "Clara, promise me," she begged. "Promise me you will not leave. Promise me you will not go looking for a fight." Eli looked at her, his expression crumbling into a profound sadness. He knew what was coming. He knew the tracks Miller had seen were not random. The net was closing. "I will never leave," he swore, his voice rough. "Unless you ask me to. Unless it is the only way to save you." "Then stay," she whispered. "Just stay." That night, the fear was a third person in the bed. They made love, but it was not the slow, reverent discovery of the previous nights. It was frantic. It was desperate. Eli moved over her with a rough urgency, his hands gripping her hips, his mouth devouring hers as if he could breathe her into his lungs and keep her there. Clara met him with equal force, her nails digging into his back, scratching over the old scars. She arched against him, demanding more, demanding everything. "Mine," she gasped against his neck. "You are mine." "Yours," Eli groaned. "Always." They tangled together, sweat slicking their skin despite the cold room. Every touch was a claim, every kiss a seal against the darkness waiting outside. When the end came, it was shattering, leaving them both gasping and clinging to one another in the aftermath, their hearts beating a frantic rhythm against their ribs. They slept fitfully, waking at every creak of the timbers, reaching out to ensure the other was still there. Morning broke with a deceptive calm. The sky was a brilliant, hard blue. Eli rose before the sun. He dressed in silence, pulling on his boots and strapping the gun belt around his waist. Clara watched him from the bed, the quilt pulled up to her chin. "I'm going to check the perimeter," he said softly. "I will not go far." Clara nodded. She watched him slip out the door, the blast of cold air chilling the room. She got up and began to make coffee. She moved mechanically, her mind replaying the scene in the store, replaying Eli's promise. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Eli stepped inside. He did not take off his coat. He did not take off his hat. His face was grim, set in lines of hard resolve. Clara set the coffee pot down. Her hands went cold. "What is it?" she asked. "Tracks," Eli said. "On the ridge, about a mile out." He walked to the table and began to load cartridges into the loops of his belt. His movements were efficient, practiced. "How many?" Clara asked. She felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. The waiting was over. "4," Eli said. "Shod horses." They stopped on the rise and looked down at the cabin. Cigarette butts in the snow. They were there for a while. He looked up at her. "It is them. Clara. My old crew. Dutch and others." He snapped the leather flap of his holster shut. "They will come at dusk," he said. "That is Dutch's way. He likes the failing light." He crossed the room and took her by the shoulders. "You have to go." Clara stared at him. "What?" "Take the mare," Eli said, his words coming fast, urgent. "Ride to the town. Go to the marshal if there is one, or just hide in the church. They won't touch you there. They want me. When they find me here, they will be satisfied." "No," Clara said. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. "Listen to me." Eli shook her slightly. "These men are not like the shopkeepers in town. They are killers. They will burn this cabin down with us inside. If you are here, they will use you to get to me. I cannot fight them if I am worrying about you." "I am not leaving," Clara said. Her voice was low, trembling with fury. "This is my home. You are mine. I am a dead man walking." "Clara!" Eli shouted. "Do not die for a mistake I made in Wyoming. Do not die for me." Clara pulled her arm free. She swung her hand and slapped him. The sound was sharp, cracking like a whip in the small room. Eli's head snapped to the side. He froze. He turned slowly back to look at her, his cheek reddening. Clara stood before him, her chest heaving, tears standing in her eyes. She looked fierce. She looked like the frontier itself, beautiful and harsh and unyielding. "Don't you dare!" she hissed. "Don't you dare take this away from me. I have spent 2 years dying in this cabin. I have spent 2 years being afraid of the wind and the dark and the silence. You brought me back to life. Eli, you don't get to decide when that ends." She walked to the corner and picked up Silas's Winchester. She checked the lever, just as she had seen him do. She turned back to him, the heavy rifle looking large in her hands, but her grip steady. "You promised," she said, her voice breaking. "You said you would never leave unless I asked you to. I am not asking." Eli stared at her. He looked at the red mark on his cheek. He looked at the rifle in her hands. He saw the woman who had dragged him through the snow, who had stitched his flesh, who had danced barefoot by the fire. He realized then that he couldn't send her away. Even if he bound her hands and feet and put her on the horse, she would crawl back. She was part of this now. She was part of him. A slow, painful pride filled his chest. "All right," Eli whispered. "All right." He reached out and touched the spot where she had slapped him, then let his hand drop to his gun. "If we do this," he said, his voice regaining its steel, "we do it my way. We turn this cabin into a fortress, and we kill every son of a bitch that rides up that hill." Clara nodded. She wiped the tears from her eyes with the back of her hand. "Tell me what to do," she said. Eli looked at the window, where the sun was beginning its long arc toward the west, toward dusk. "Get the table," he said. "Tip it on its side. We need cover." They began to move furniture. The fragility of the last few days was gone, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of war. The sun began its slow, bleeding descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows that stretched across the snow like the fingers of a dying giant. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gun oil and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. They had spent the afternoon turning the small home into a fortress. The heavy oak table, where they had shared meager meals and tentative glances, was now overturned on its side facing the door. It was a barricade of solid timber. The windows were shuttered, but Eli had used his knife to pry small gaps in the wood, firing ports that offered a sliver of the valley below. Eli moved with a grim, terrifying efficiency. He did not look like the lover who had held her in the dark the night before. He looked like a soldier preparing for a massacre. He checked the load in his Colt revolver 3 times. He placed the box of cartridges Clara had bought on the floor behind the table, the brass casings gleaming in the dim light. "They will rush the door," Eli said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Dutch is not a patient man. He will try to overwhelm us with noise and fire. He will want to end it quickly before the cold sets in deep." Clara nodded. She stood by the fireplace, holding Silas's Winchester rifle. Her hands were steady, though her stomach churned with a nausea she could not swallow. She was wearing the red wool shawl her mother had sent her 5 years ago for Christmas. It was the only bright thing in the room, a splash of blood-colored warmth against the gray logs and the impending violence. "Do not fire until I do," Eli instructed, not looking at her. "And when you fire, Clara, you do not aim for the arm or the leg. You aim for the center of the chest. You put them down." "I know," Clara said softly. "I have hunted before." "This isn't a deer," Eli said, turning to look at her. His eyes were hard, but for a fleeting second, they softened. "A deer doesn't shoot back." He crossed the room and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, warm, and alive. "If they get inside," he whispered. "If I go down, you go out the back window. You run into the trees. You don't look back. You understand?" Clara grabbed his wrist, digging her fingers into his skin. "I am not running. Eli, I am not leaving you." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. He kissed her forehead, a hard, pressing kiss that felt like a seal. Then he moved back to the overturned table. "Dusk is here," he said. The valley fell into twilight. The wind died down, leaving a silence that was almost deafening. It was Christmas Eve. Clara thought of the church in town, the candles being lit, the hymns being sung. She thought of the peace she had craved for 2 years. Then came the sound. It was the crunch of snow under hooves. Heavy, rhythmic, getting louder. Clara moved to her position behind the wood box near the window. She rested the barrel of the Winchester on the sill, peering through the crack in the shutter. 4 shapes emerged from the tree line. They were dark silhouettes against the blue-gray snow, riding big horses that blew steam into the freezing air. They did not ride with caution. They rode abreast, confident, arrogant. They stopped 20 yards from the porch. The leader, a man with a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, guided his horse forward a few steps. He sat easily in the saddle, resting a hand on the pommel. "Eli," the voice was deep, scratching against the silence of the valley. It was a voice that expected obedience. "I know you are in there, boy. We saw the smoke. We saw the tracks." Eli did not answer. He crouched behind the table, his pistol leveled at the door. "Come on out. Eli," the man shouted again. "Don't make us burn you out. You come out. We settle this like men. We leave the woman be." Eli glanced at Clara. His lip curled in a silent snarl. He knew it was a lie. They would leave no witnesses. "You hear me, Eli?" the man called, his voice turning mocking. "Or are you hiding behind her skirts? That's a new low, even for a traitor like you." One of the other men laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Go to hell, Dutch," Eli roared back. The shout seemed to shatter the air. "Have it your way," Dutch yelled. The explosion of violence was instantaneous. Dutch raised his arm, and the 4 men spurred their horses forward. At the same time, the glass of the window above Clara's head shattered inward, spraying her with shards. A bullet thudded into the log wall behind her. "Fire!" Eli shouted. He rose from behind the table and fired through the gap in the door planks. The boom of the heavy Colt was deafening in the small space. Outside, a horse screamed. One of the riders was thrown, tumbling into the snow. Clara squeezed her eyes shut for a heartbeat, then forced them open. She looked through the crack. The men had dismounted, scrambling for cover behind the woodpile and the water trough. Muzzle flashes blossomed like deadly flowers in the twilight. Bullets hammered the cabin. The wood splintered, sending sharp fragments flying through the room. A lantern on the mantel exploded, raining glass onto the hearth. "Watch the window!" Eli yelled, firing 2 shots in rapid succession. Clara saw a movement to her left. One of the men, a lanky figure in a duster, was sprinting toward the side of the cabin, trying to flank them. He was heading for the window where she stood. She leveled the Winchester. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it would crack her ribs. She saw his face. He was young, grinning with a feral excitement. He raised a pistol. Clara didn't think. Instinct took over. She exhaled, just as Silas had taught her when aiming at a buck, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the stock biting into her bruise. The man in the duster jerked backward as if he had been yanked by an invisible rope. A dark bloom appeared in the center of his chest. He fell backward into the snow, his pistol discharging harmlessly into the sky. "I got him," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I got him! Keep shooting!" Eli roared. The door splintered as a heavy slug punched through the oak. Eli grunted, doubling over. "Eli!" Clara screamed. "I am fine," he snarled. Straightening up, he was clutching his left arm, blood welling between his fingers. But he brought the Colt up and fired again. The man behind the water trough stood up to return fire. Eli's shot caught him in the throat. He dropped without a sound. 2 down, 2 left. "Reloading!" Eli shouted. He dropped behind the table, fumbling with the ejector rod of his pistol. His hands were slick with blood. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door shuddered violently. Someone was ramming it from the outside. "Open up!" Dutch's voice roared. "Close now. Right on the porch." The hinges, the ones Eli had fixed, held for a moment. Then the wood around the lock gave way with a sickening crack. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. Dutch stood in the doorway, a massive figure in the swirling snow, a revolver in each hand. He saw Eli behind the table and raised both guns. Clara racked the lever of the Winchester, but the casing jammed. She tugged at it frantically. Eli didn't wait for the reload. He launched himself over the overturned table, a desperate, suicidal lunge. Dutch fired. The bullet caught Eli in the thigh, spinning him around, but Eli's momentum carried him forward. He crashed into Dutch, tackling him around the waist. Both men went down hard onto the porch, rolling into the snow. Clara dropped the useless rifle and scrambled for the skinning knife on the table. She ran to the door. Outside, it was a brawl of primal fury. Dutch was on top, hammering his fist into Eli's face. Eli was fighting back, but he was wounded in 2 places and losing strength fast. "I should have killed you in Cheyenne!" Dutch screamed, raising his pistol for a point-blank shot. Eli bucked his hips, throwing Dutch off balance. He knocked the gun from Dutch's hand. It spun away into the dark. Dutch roared and went for the knife at his belt. Eli was faster. He drew his own knife, the heavy bowie he had used to carve the comb. They locked together, grappling in the blood-stained snow. The wind howled around them. Clara stood in the doorway, the skinning knife in her hand, terrified to intervene for fear of hitting Eli. "Die!" Dutch hissed, driving his knife down toward Eli's throat. Eli caught Dutch's wrist. His arm shook. Blood dripped from his face onto the snow. He gritted his teeth, a guttural sound of effort tearing from his throat. With a surge of desperate strength, he twisted Dutch's arm and drove his own blade upward. The knife sank deep into Dutch's side, just under the ribs. Dutch gasped, his eyes going wide. He looked at Eli with a sudden shock. Eli twisted the blade. Dutch slumped forward, his weight pressing Eli into the snow. He twitched once, then went still. Eli shoved the heavy body off him. He lay there on his back, staring up at the darkening sky, gasping for air. The snow around him was churned and red. "Eli!" Clara dropped the knife and fell to her knees beside him. She grabbed his face, her hands frantic. "Eli, look at me! Look at me!" His eyes rolled toward her. They were hazy, unfocused. "Is he—" Eli wheezed. "He is dead," Clara sobbed. "They are all dead. You did it." She looked at his body. He was a mess of blood. His arm, his thigh, the old wound in his side, all of it was bleeding. "We have to get you inside," she said, panic rising in her voice. "It is freezing. Can't walk," Eli murmured. "Yes, you can," Clara said fiercely. "You walked through a blizzard to get to me. You can walk 10 feet. She hooked her arms under his shoulders. She pulled. He groaned, a sound of pure agony. But he tried to help her. He dug his heels into the snow. Together, they dragged his broken body back into the cabin. Clara kicked the door shut and jammed a chair under the handle to hold it. She got him to the furs by the hearth. The fire was still burning, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. Clara tore her apron into strips. She didn't have whiskey left. They had drunk it the night they danced. So she poured boiling water from the kettle into a bowl and threw in her sewing needle and the spool of red silk thread. "This is going to hurt," she wept, pressing a cloth to the wound in his thigh. Eli looked at her. His face was gray, the color of ash. "Do it." For the next hour, Clara worked with trembling hands. She dug the bullet out of his thigh with the tip of her knife, apologizing with every whimper he made. She stitched the torn flesh of his arm. She cleaned the cuts on his face. Her red shawl was stained darker now, soaked with his blood where she had pressed it against him. When she was finished, she collapsed back onto her heels, her hands covered in crimson. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Eli lay still, his breathing shallow and ragged. He opened his eyes and looked at her. "Clara," he whispered. "I am here," she said, taking his hand. "I am sorry," he rasped. A tear leaked from the corner of his eye, cutting a clean track through the blood on his cheek. "I am sorry I brought this here, to your home." Clara squeezed his hand. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, tasting salt and iron. "You brought me back to life," she whispered. "Before you, I was just waiting to die. You saved me, Eli. I ruined everything," he mumbled, his eyes fluttering closed. "Rest now," she commanded softly. "We survived. That is everything." But they could not rest. Not yet. The bodies were outside. The wolves would come. And worse, if the snow covered them, they would be frozen there until spring, grim sentinels of death on her doorstep. "We have to burn them," Eli said an hour later. He had forced himself to sit up, drinking the water she offered. "You cannot move," Clara argued. "I have to," he said. "I will not leave trash in your yard on Christmas." It was a gruesome, hellish task. Clara did most of the work. She hitched the mare to the bodies one by one and dragged them to the brush pile near the tree line, a stack of dry pine and deadfall she had cleared in the autumn. Eli limped out, leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch he had fashioned from a piece of the broken table. He poured the last of the coal oil from the lantern over the pile. Clara stood back, clutching her shawl tight around her. The cold was biting now, a deep, bitter freeze that seeped into the bone. Eli struck a match. He tossed it onto the pile. The oil caught with a whoosh. Orange flames roared up, illuminating the night, casting grotesque shadows against the trees. The fire hissed and popped as it consumed the men who had come to kill them. Clara stared at the flames. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, crushing horror. She had killed a man. She had watched Eli kill 3 others. The violence of it, the sheer waste of life, crashed down on her. She sank to her knees in the snow. A sob tore from her throat, loud and jagged. Then another. She covered her face with her hands and wept, her body shaking with the force of her grief. Grief for the lost innocence. Grief for the brutality of the world. Grief for the pain Eli was in. Eli moved toward her. He dropped his crutch and sank down into the snow beside her. Ignoring the pain in his leg, he pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, rocking her back and forth as the fire roared in front of them. "I got you," he whispered into her hair. "I got you, Clara. It's over." She buried her face in his coat, smelling the blood and the smoke. She clung to him as if he were the only anchor in a spinning world. "Don't leave," she whispered, her voice broken by sobs. "Please, don't leave me when this is done." Eli pulled back slightly to look at her. The firelight danced in his dark eyes. He looked wrecked, battered, and exhausted, but the love in his face was terrifyingly clear. "I told you," he said softly. "I am not going anywhere. I am yours." Clara shook her head. Promise me you will stay. Be mine." Eli brushed a stray lock of hair from her tear-stained cheek. His thumb traced her lip. "Only if you ask me like you did that night," he murmured. The memory of the firelight, the buffalo furs, and the desperate need washed over her. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet it was the moment that had bound them together. Clara looked at him. She saw the man who had fought for her, bled for her, and killed for her. She took a shuddering breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "Spread my legs," she breathed, the words forming a vow in the darkness. "And love me." Eli closed his eyes. He let out a breath that was half prayer, half surrender. He kissed her, tasting the tears on her lips. "Always," he whispered against her mouth. "Always." They sat there in the snow, holding each other as the pyre burned. Two broken souls warming themselves by the fire of their own survival, while the stars of Christmas Eve watched silently from above. The morning sun broke over the eastern ridge not with the gray, reluctant light of the storm, but with a brilliant, blinding gold that shattered against the snow. It was a Christmas morning light, pure and unforgiving in its clarity. Inside the cabin, the air was still and cold, the fire having died down to a bed of white ash during the few hours they had slept. Clara woke first. For a moment, in the haze between dreams and waking, she did not remember the blood or the fire. She only felt the weight of the quilt and the heavy, radiant heat of the man beside her. She turned her head. Eli was sleeping on his back, his face turned toward the ceiling, in the harsh light of day. The toll of the night before was etched plainly onto him. His face was bruised, turning a violet shade of purple along the jawline where Dutch had struck him. There was a smear of dried blood on his neck that she had missed. His breathing was shallow, guarded even in sleep to protect the ribs that were likely cracked, and the bandages on his arm and chest were stark white against his skin. Clara watched him, her heart swelling with a sensation so painful and vast it frightened her. He was still here. He had not vanished with the smoke of the pyre. She shifted, curling her body into his side, careful not to press against his wounds. Eli's eyes opened instantly. There was no drowsiness in them, only a sudden, sharp alertness that faded the moment he saw her face. "Morning," he rasped. His voice sounded like rocks tumbling in a dry creek bed. "Merry Christmas," Clara whispered. Eli blinked, as if the concept of a holiday was a foreign language he was trying to translate. He looked at the window, where the frost patterns were glowing with sunlight. "I lived," he said, more to himself than to her. "You did," Clara said, resting her hand on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "We both did." He tried to sit up, and a hiss of pain escaped through his teeth. His face went pale, but he forced himself upright, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "You should stay down," Clara admonished, sitting up with him. "You lost blood. Eli, you have stitches in 3 places." "I have work to do." Eli grunted. He reached for his trousers, his movements stiff and slow. "Fence is down on the south side. Saw it when we rode in yesterday. Cattle will get out if I don't fix it." Clara stared at him. "We don't have cattle, Eli." "We will," he said. He pulled his boots on, suppressing a groan as he bent over. "Come spring, we will need the fence." He stood up, swaying slightly, then found his balance. He grabbed the heavy coat, now mended with her red thread and stiff with dried blood, and pulled it on. He picked up his hat from where it had fallen during the fight, dusted the snow from the brim, and placed it on his head. He looked at her. "Coffee?" "I will make it," Clara said, smiling despite the tears pricking her eyes. She watched him from the window as the coffee boiled. He was limping, dragging his left leg through the deep snow, but he moved with a stubborn, relentless determination. He found the hammer and the bag of nails in the lean-to. He trudged to the south side of the clearing, where the wind had blown down a section of the split-rail fence she had tried to build alone 2 months ago. He didn't just prop it up. He stripped off his coat, despite the freezing air, and began to drive new posts. He worked with a grim focus, reclaiming the land, reclaiming the perimeter of their home. Clara pressed her hand to the cold glass. She had spent 2 years looking out this window and seeing only emptiness. Now, she saw a man building a future. She saw a man who had decided that this scrap of rocky earth was worth bleeding for. By the time the sun was high, the fence was fixed. Eli came back inside, his face red with cold, his breath clouding the air. He looked exhausted, but there was a peace in his eyes she had never seen before. "Fence is done," he said, hanging his hat on the peg. "Sit," Clara commanded, placing a plate of cornbread and salt pork on the table. "Eat." They ate in a companionable silence, the kind that does not need words to fill the spaces. But the silence was broken an hour later by a sound that made Eli's hand drop instantly to the colt at his hip. Sleigh bells. It was a cheerful, jingling sound, completely at odds with the violence of the previous night. Eli stood up, wincing, and moved to the window. Clara joined him. Coming up the valley road was not a posse of gunmen. It was a procession. 3 sleighs, pulled by heavy draft horses, were carving a path through the fresh snow. "Townfolk," Eli said, his voice tight. "They saw the fire last night. They are not armed," Clara observed. "At least, not for a fight." The sleighs pulled up into the yard. It was Mr. Henderson from the Mercantile, accompanied by his wife. Behind them was Mrs. Gable, the oldest widow in Purgatory Creek, and the Reverend Thomas. In the last sleigh sat 3 men Clara recognized as ranch hands from the double bar spread south of town. Clara opened the door. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her red shawl tight around her. Eli stood just behind her, in the shadow of the doorframe, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Mr. Henderson stepped down from the first sleigh. He looked at the blackened patch of earth near the tree line where the fire had burned. He looked at the shattered window. He looked at the bloodstains on the porch wood that Clara hadn't had time to scrub away. He took off his hat. He looked at Clara, and his face flushed with a mixture of shame and respect. "Mrs. Miller," Henderson said. He cleared his throat. We saw the fire last night. We heard the shooting. We thought—" He trailed off. He didn't say what they thought. They thought she was dead. They thought the Ice Widow had finally been claimed by the winter. "We are fine, Mr. Henderson," Clara said, her voice clear and strong. "We had trouble. It is finished." Henderson nodded slowly. He looked at Eli, who stepped out of the shadows then. The shopkeeper's eyes widened as he took in the cowboy's battered face, the bandages, and the way he stood. Protective, dangerous, and unyielding. "I see," Henderson said. He reached into the back of his sleigh. "We brought, well, it is Christmas. My wife baked pies, and we brought a side of beef, Mrs." Gable climbed down from the second sleigh. She was a tiny woman, bent with age, wrapped in black wool. She walked up the steps, ignoring the bloodstains, and stood before Clara. "Mrs." Gable had buried 3 husbands and 4 sons. She knew the look of death. She also knew the look of survival. She reached out and took Clara's hands. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "We heard the gunfire. Clara—" "Mrs.," Gable said softly, "we knew you were alone up here. Or we thought you were." She glanced at Eli. "We came to bury you. I'm glad we were wrong." "I am not alone," Clara said, looking at Eli. "Mrs." Gable followed her gaze. She looked at Eli, really looked at him, seeing past the scars and the gun belt to the way he was watching Clara. She saw the devotion written in the tension of his shoulders. "No," the old woman said, her eyes crinkling. "I can see that." She squeezed Clara's hand. "He is not the only one you saved. My dear, I think you saved yourself, too." The tension broke. The men from the ranch unloaded the beef and carried it to the lean-to. The Reverend's wife brought in a basket of candles and a jar of peppermint sticks. "We cannot stay long," Henderson said, looking at the sky. "The road is treacherous, but—" "We wanted to know." "Thank you," Clara said. She hesitated, then opened the door wider. Would you come in for coffee?" "It is hot." The invitation hung in the air. For 2 years, no one from town had crossed her threshold. For 2 years, she had been an outcast. Henderson looked at his wife. She smiled. "We would be delighted." Clara. The cabin, usually so silent, filled with noise. It was a strange, miraculous transformation. The Reverend's wife exclaimed over Clara's red shawl. The ranch hands shook Eli's hand with a cautious respect, asking him about the fence line, studiously ignoring the fresh bullet holes in the walls. Clara moved through the room, pouring coffee, cutting the pie misses. Henderson had brought. She felt light, weightless. The heavy mantle of judgment she had worn for so long had evaporated. They didn't see a witch or a murderer anymore. They saw a woman who had fought for her life and won. Eli sat in the corner, his legs stretched out before him. He didn't say much. He watched the room with the wariness of a wolf that had been invited to a tea party, but he didn't leave. When Clara passed him to refill the Reverend's cup, she felt a hand catch her skirt. She looked down. Eli reached out and took her free hand. He squeezed it, hard, possessive, reassuring. He looked up at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted in the ghost of a smile. He didn't belong to this world of townsfolk and church socials. He was a creature of the wild, of the storm, but he was sitting here, drinking coffee from a china cup, because this was her world, and he was living in it. The guests left in the late afternoon, before the sun dipped too low. The bells jingled away down the valley, leaving silence in their wake. But it was not the heavy, crushing silence of before. It was a peaceful silence, filled with the scent of pine needles and roasted beef. Clara closed the door and locked it, not with the frantic terror of the night before, but with the routine of a woman securing her home for the night. She turned to the room. The candles the townspeople had brought were lit, casting a warm, golden glow over the logs. "They like you," Eli said. He was still sitting in the chair, looking at the fire. "They are curious about you," Clara corrected. She walked over to him. "They think you are a mystery, a dangerous stranger who swept in and saved the widow." "They aren't wrong about the dangerous part," Eli muttered. "No," Clara said. She knelt beside his chair, resting her head on his knee. "But they are wrong about the stranger part. You are not a stranger. You are family." The word hung in the air. Family. It was a word Eli hadn't claimed in 20 years. "I cooked supper," Clara said softly. "The beef is good. We should eat." They sat at the small table, the candle flickering between them. It was the first Christmas dinner Clara had hosted in 3 years. It wasn't goose and crystal glasses in St. Louis. It was roast beef and cornbread on tin plates in a bullet-riddled cabin in Montana. And it was perfect. Eli reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was rough, calloused from the reins and the gun and the fence post. "Thank you," he said. "For the beef?" Clara teased gently. "For the shelter," Eli said. "For the stitching. For not running." Clara turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. "I told you, I am not running." That night, the wind picked up again, but it was a gentle wind, dusting the roof with fresh powder. The cabin was warm. They went to bed early, exhausted by the physical and emotional toll of the last 48 hours. They stripped off their clothes by the firelight. Clara looked at Eli's body, the fresh bandages, the old scars, the map of a hard life written on his skin. She didn't see ugliness. She saw history. She saw survival. They climbed under the thick quilts, naked skin pressing against naked skin. The heat they generated was immediate and encompassing. Eli groaned as he settled, his leg throbbing, but he pulled her close. He needed the contact. He needed to know she was there. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, her arm draped across his chest. She traced the line of his jaw with her finger. "What comes next, Eli?" she asked into the darkness. It was the question that had been hovering over them. The gang was dead. But Eli was still a wanted man. The winter was still long. The world was still hard. Eli was silent for a long moment. She could feel the vibration of his chest as he breathed. The snow will melt, he said slowly. The pass will open. People will come asking questions about the men we burned. Let them ask, Clara said fiercely. We will have to work the land, Eli continued. The roof needs more than patching. We need to plant in the spring. We need cattle if we are going to eat next winter. He paused, his hand moving up to stroke her hair. It won't be easy. Clara, I'm not a farmer. I'm a gunman with a bad leg and a price on his head. Trouble will find us again. I know, Clara whispered. But, Eli said, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to come from the center of the earth. We survived. That is what we do. We survive together. Clara closed her eyes, letting the promise wash over her. Together. It was a stronger word than love. Love could burn out. Love could be soft. Survival was iron. Survival was the axe biting into the wood and the bullet hitting the mark. Together, she echoed. She shifted, lifting her head to look at him in the dim light. The shadows softened the harsh angles of his face. He looked younger now. The weight of the inevitable death he had been carrying finally lifted. Merry Christmas, Cowboy, she whispered joyfully. Eli looked at her. He saw the young woman who had been trapped in ice, now thawing, burning, alive. He saw the strength in her jaw and the softness in her eyes. He saw the only thing he had ever wanted to protect. He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her thigh, then moving up to kiss the curve of her breast, and finally, softly, her lips. Merry Christmas, widow, he murmured against her mouth. The firelight flickered one last time before fading into the embers. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle and silent, covering the scars on the land, covering the ashes of the past. Inside, two broken hearts beat in rhythm, mending in the warmth of each other's arms, ready to face the long, hard winter of the rest of their lives. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Clara and Eli. It has been a journey through the snow and the heartache of the Montana frontier, and I hope their story of survival and love brought some warmth to your day. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story in English. Did Clara and Eli's ending resonate with you? If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to From Wild West for more tales of grit, passion, and the American frontier. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open.